This week's lecture material will be coming from chapter 24 in your textbook, and we'll be looking at the digestive system physiology. The gastrointestinal tract or alimentary canal is a tube that's open to the outside world on both ends. So at one end we have the mouth, and at the other end we have the anus. Starting at the mouth, the alimentary canal then includes the mouth, the pharynx, and then the esophagus, which will transport the food into the stomach. The stomach then empties into the small intestine, and there are three parts of the small intestine. We have the duodenum, and then the jejunum, and then the ileum. And the ileum then will empty into the large intestine, and the large intestine is composed of the cecum, so the ileum empties into the cecum. And then we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, which empties into the rectum, and the rectum then will empty into the anal canal. And the anus again is going to communicate again with the outside world. Also a part of the digestive system are accessory digestive organs. So these organs will help to aid in the digestive process and breaking down foods and making the foodstuffs available, or nutrients within the foods available for the body to use. So in the mouth we have the teeth and the tongue that help to break down the food and to manipulate the food, and as well salivary glands, which help to emulsify food, soften it up, and also begin the digestive process in the mouth, particularly for carbohydrates, which we'll see. And then further down the tube we have the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas, and these accessory organs will all secrete their enzymes and fluids into the digestive tube to help break down the foods and make the building blocks of these foods that we're eating available for the body to use. The gastrointestinal tract is basically a disassembly line, which means that as food is moved down the tube, nutrients become more available to the body in each step. So basically whatever foods that we consume, we have to break these foods down into their basic building blocks before we can absorb those nutrients into our body. There are 6 steps to the digestive process. There's ingestion, propulsion, mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. So ingestion will refer to the taking in of food into the mouth, and once the food is in the mouth, we'll use the teeth and the tongue to masticate or to break down the food into smaller pieces, and as well as salivary glands will help to liquefy the food as well as begin the process of digestion as well. We'll see that in the mouth that there is an enzyme, salivary amylase, that's in the secretions that help to start to break down the carbohydrates that you're consuming. Once we decide that we're ready to swallow, we'll push that food to the back of our mouths or to the top of the pharynx, and then we'll initiate swallowing. So swallowing is the first act of propulsion, and swallowing is a voluntary activity. We decide when we're going to swallow, and then once we swallow the bolus of food, it will enter into the esophagus, and from there on it's out of our control. Propulsion will be due to the act of peristalsis, which is a contraction and relaxation of the muscles that are within the wall of the tube. And this will continue through the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine will have this action of peristalsis that will propel the food forward. Next is we're looking at mechanical digestion. So this is mechanical actions that are breaking down food. So in the mouth, chewing is part of mechanical digestion. The stomach, there's a lot of churning of the stomach. The stomach is a very muscular organ that will pummel the food once it enters into the stomach and help to mechanically break it down. So this is called churning. And then also within the small intestine, there's a modification of peristalsis that's called segmentation, and that's basically a back and forth movement of the food that will as well mechanically break down the food into smaller pieces, so to speak. Next, we have chemical digestion, and chemical digestion is the catabolic breakdown of food. So this is with the use of enzymes and fluids that are within the gastrointestinal tract, as well as the accessory organs, the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas will secrete enzymes and fluids into the digestive tube to help to chemically break down the food into its basic building blocks. So when we consume carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, we have to break these things down into their basic building blocks before we could absorb them into our blood system or into our body, so that we can use those basic building blocks as nutrients. Next is absorption. Absorption primarily takes place in the small intestine, so the nutrients that we absorb out of the gastrointestinal tract and into our bodies occurs primarily in the small intestine. Proteins and carbohydrates, they're basic building blocks. So proteins will be broken down into amino acids. Carbohydrates be broken down into simple sugars. They'll be absorbed out of the tube and into the blood vessels that are in communication with the tube, whereas fats will be broken down and absorbed into the lymphatic vessels. And we'll see that in a little bit more detail going forward. So most absorption occurs in the small intestine. And then whatever we can't use, whatever the body can't digest and absorb, will continue on and enter into the large intestine. And in the large intestine, we have some or significant amount of water that gets reabsorbed as well out of the large intestine, but there's no absorption of nutrients that occurs for the most part in the large intestine. Most of that occurs only in the small intestine. And then the last act is defecation, and this is the elimination of the indigestible solid wastes that began as the food that we ingested. The act of swallowing, or deglutition, is broken up into a voluntary and an involuntary phases. The voluntary phase is the buccal phase, which buccal refers to the mouth. And so again, you decide when you're ready to swallow, and so that's a voluntary action. And the muscles then that are involved are skeletal muscles. So you know that skeletal muscles in the body are voluntary muscles. You have control over them. And then once the food enters into the pharynx and further into the esophagus, these two phases are involuntary, involves involuntary propulsion of the food by the act of peristalsis. So smooth muscle now that's in the walls of these tubes will be activated to move or propel the food forward. So again, smooth muscle in the body is involuntary muscle. You have no conscious control over that action, and it's primarily controlled by the brainstem. And we'll see also local receptors that are within the walls of these tubes will also stimulate peristalsis. So that's an involuntary action. The wall of the gastrointestinal tract from the lower esophagus to the anal canal has basically the same four layers. So we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa layers. Within the mucosa is going to be the most internal layer, so it's in contact with the lumen, or the inner opening of the digestive tube. And the layer that's in contact with the lumen itself, or would be in contact with the food once it's in there, is the epithelium. And the epithelium has the function of secretion of fluids and enzymes, as well as the function of absorption of the nutrients that are in the tube. And we see also that there's a role of protection. You see in this diagram that there are lymphatic nodules, and we see throughout the alimentary canal, because this tube is open to the outside world on both ends, the mouth and the anus, we need to have a very strong immune system presence along this tube to prevent or protect us from foreign pathogens, things that we don't want entering our body. And this is the role of the mucosal layer. Has a lot of this lymphatic tissue, lymphatic nodules present that will help to protect us from foreign antigens that may be in the tube. The next layer is the submucosa, and the submucosa has the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels, and this is where the nutrients that are being presented to our body from within the tube will enter into these blood vessels and lymphatic vessels to be transported to other areas in the body for where we can use these nutrients. Also, with in the submucosal layer, there is the submucosal plexus, and this plexus is a network of nerves, and when these nerves stimulate the submucosa and the mucosa, you see that there are glands, lots of glands in this layer that will secrete their fluids into the digestive tube to help to emulsify the food, help to neutralize the acidity, and also enzymatically help to break down the foodstuffs. So the submucosal plexus is a nerve supplied to these glands, so it'll stimulate the secretion of fluids from these glands into the tube. The next layer is the muscularis, and this is going to contain the smooth muscle that's in the tube. So we have circular muscle and we have longitudinal muscle, and it's these smooth muscles that will help to propel the food forward by peristalsis, and also will be involved in the process of segmentation, which is a back and forth movement of the food, which helps to mechanically break down the food as well. And we see in this layer that we have the myenteric plexus, and the myenteric plexus is that network of nerves that will stimulate the smooth muscle to contract when we want to increase peristalsis. Together, the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus is known as the enteric plexus, and this is part of the autonomic nervous system. So again, these nerves are not under your control, conscious control. They sense when there's stuff in the tube, and we'll talk in a little more detail about that further on, but when the pH changes in the tube, or the fact that there's something in the tube will stretch receptors in the wall of the tube, and that will stimulate the enteric plexus to fire, to increase peristalsis, and to increase glandular secretions into the tube to help with digestion. So together, these two plexuses form the enteric plexus, which is also known as the gut brain. So the gut brain refers to the fact that this is a nervous system that doesn't require conscious control. So it has an intelligence that knows when there is stuff in the tube that needs to be moved along, or also emulsify with different fluids and enzymes. If we look at peristalsis and segmentation, so both of these processes are going to be using the smooth muscle, the circular and longitudinal muscle layers in the muscularis layer of the tube. Peristalsis just refers to the forward motion of the foodstuff in the tube, and this will continue from the lower esophagus right through to the anus. And segmentation refers to a back and forth movement of the foodstuff. So what the image is trying to illustrate is that when the circular muscle is contracting, it'll pinch off or squeeze off half of that bolus of food, so half of it goes backwards and half of it will go forward, and this continues back and forth, so there's a mixing and of this food stuff. It also slows down the movement of the food stuff, so we want things to move fairly slowly through the small intestine in particular, to give time for nutrients to be absorbed. So this back and forth segmentation motion is part of the mechanical digestion that occurs in the alimentary canal. Looking at the neural innervation of the digestive tract, remember that this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. This is not under your conscious control. And the two arms of the autonomic nervous system are the parasympathetic arm and the sympathetic arm. Parasympathetic stimulation will increase digestive processes. Remember, rest and digest for parasympathetic nervous system. So this means that the submucosal plexus That part of the enteric plexus will increase glandular secretions into the tube to aid in digestion. And also the myenteric plexus, again, the other part of the enteric plexus, will increase activity to induce peristalsis and keep things moving along the tube. Sympathetic nerve stimulation, on the other hand, will decrease glandular secretions into the tube and also decrease peristaltic actions. So it inhibits the digestive processes. So generally when your sympathetic nervous system is active, it means that you're in a fight or flight mode. So you don't need to expend energy in the digestive process at this point. You're going to divert blood away from your digestive system to your skeletal muscles and your heart muscle and your brain and those tissues that require more energy, more oxygen for the purposes of fight or flight. For the enteric plexus to know what to do, it has to be receiving information from receptors that are within the digestive tube. So the different types of receptors we have are mechanical receptors, chemical receptors, and osmoreceptors. So these receptors will respond to the stretch. When there's something in the tube, it'll stimulate stretch receptors. Osmolarity, the contents of the digestive tube is generally very watery medium, and so when stuff is in that water, it's going to change the osmolarity of it, and also the change in pH. So whenever there is substrate in the tube, these factors will fire these different receptors, and that information is sent to the enteric plexus, and then the enteric plexus knows whether it needs to increase glandular secretions or increase peristaltic actions and keep things moving along. Nervous control of the GI tract is broken down into short reflexes and long reflexes. Short reflexes refer to the reflexes that occur or the actions that occur due to the fact that something is in the tube, so there's an internal GI tract stimuli. The presence of foodstuffs in the tube will activate chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, and or mechanoreceptors, and this will stimulate the gut brain or the enteric plexus, which will then locally create the smooth muscle activation in the tube as well as the glandular secretions within the tube. So these are short reflexes, meaning that this is all occurring within the gastrointestinal wall. When these chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, and mechanoreceptors fire, they also send that information to the central nervous system. So the central nervous system will then initiate long reflexes to continue or to emphasize the parasympathetic activity that is aiding in the digestive process. Long reflexes as well will be stimulated by external stimuli. So, for example, the sight of food, the smell of food, the taste, or even the thought of food. Okay, and we all know this, that if we see food or if we smell food or if we even just start thinking about food, and it can stimulate digestive processes in our body. You start to hear things are moving in your stomach and your glands are secreting in your mouth. And so these long reflexes will initiate the digestive process even before food will even enter your mouth. So these are the two basic controls of the GI tract, these long reflexes and these short reflexes. Both are going to be involving the autonomic nervous system, but one's going to be involving stimuli from within the tube to initiate the short reflexes, and the other will primarily deal with stimuli that is outside of the tube, such as sight, smell, taste, or thought of food, that will stimulate these long reflexes. The wall of the stomach is composed of 3 layers of smooth muscle. There's a circular layer, a longitudinal layer, and also an oblique layer. So this very muscular organ aggressively churns and pummels the food once it enters the stomach. And now the food is known as chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. And so the mechanical digestion proceeds, and as well there's numerous glands, gastric glands that we'll look at, that are in the wall of the stomach that will secrete a gastric juice that will help to now chemically break down the food or the chyme that's in the lumen of the stomach. So also we have the an anatomical variation of these highly folded structures called rugae. So the mucosa lining of the stomach is highly folded, and these rugae will increase the surface area available to the food so that we can more efficiently break it down with the enzymes and the acid that's in the stomach. The food will slowly progress towards the pyloric antrum, or the pyloric end of the stomach, and we see the pyloric sphincter. That's the valve that will open into the duodenum. The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, and we'll see that as the chyme is making its way towards the pyloric sphincter, a little bit is released into the duodenum at a time. The gastric glands are located in the mucosal layer of the stomach wall, and they contain different cells that will secrete different things into the lumen of the stomach, which will aid in the digestive process. Figure 24.12 and table 24.3 in your textbook will illustrate a little more detail in the different types of cells in these glands, as well as list the secretions from these different cell types and the functions of these secretions. So you need to look at those two things. First of all, the stomach itself is an extremely acidic structure, or the environment is extremely acidic, very harsh environment inside the stomach. So we need to protect the stomach wall itself from its own acidity. So the mucous neck cells will secrete a very alkaline mucus that's very rich in bicarbonate. Remember, bicarbonate, HCO3 negative. And this will help to protect the wall of the stomach from the acidity that's in the stomach itself. So that's the function of the mucous neck cells. Next we have the parietal cells. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid, so it's the HCl that produces the acidic environment inside the stomach. And the hydrochloric acid will help to begin to denature or to break down the peptide bonds in the proteins that we consume. And as well, the hydrochloric acid will activate an enzyme known as pepsin. So pepsin will also break the peptide bonds, or start to break the bonds between the amino acids that form the proteins. So hydrochloric acid itself will denature protein bonds, and also the hydrochloric acid will activate the enzyme pepsin, and pepsin's function is to also break peptide bonds. So we see that in the stomach. This is the first place where you start to get the breakdown of protein. Also, the function of the hydrochloric acid is to create this acidity that will destroy most bacteria. Most bacteria can't survive in the very acidic environment of the stomach, pH of roughly 2, strong enough to dissolve a penny. So most bacteria can't survive that environment, and that's one of the functions of the hydrochloric acid secreted by the parietal cells. The parietal cells will also secrete intrinsic factor, and you need to know this, you'll get asked this. Intrinsic factor is required to enter into the small intestine so that we can absorb B12 out of the small intestine. And if you recall, B12 is necessary for producing red blood cells. So if there's a problem, and you'll learn about a type of anemia called pernicious anemia, where people are not making B12, or they're not having, making intrinsic factor. So if they don't have intrinsic factor being released from the stomach parietal cells and entering into the small intestine, then whatever B12 they're consuming, that B12 can't get absorbed out of the digestive tube and into your system. So you can develop an anemia, inability to produce enough red blood cells as a result. So parietal cells will secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. As well, we have chief cells in the gastric glands. The chief cells will produce pepsinogen. Pepsinogen then is a precursor to pepsin. So once there's hydrochloric acid in contact with the pepsinogen, the hydrochloric acid will convert pepsinogen to pepsin. Pepsin is the active enzyme that will break down the peptide bonds forming the protein structures. And then we also have the endocrine cells, or the enteroendocrine cells, that will secrete the hormone gastrin. So these are G cells secreting gastrin, and gastrin, being a hormone, once it's released, will enter into the blood supply, into the circulatory system, and then will make its way back into the stomach. And once back in the stomach, it will stimulate the chief cells and the parietal cells to secrete their secretions. So it's going to increase the digestive activity in the stomach, and as well it's going to also increase the tone of the esophageal sphincter, so that the contents that's in the stomach being churned and pummeled in that very acidic environment is not going to reflux back up into the lower esophagus and create symptoms of heartburn in people. This slide will illustrate the stimulatory and inhibitory actions or events and how they will control the activity within the stomach. So if we look at the stimulatory events first on the left-hand side, we see that there is a cephalic phase, a gastric phase, and an intestinal phase. And so these are all stimulatory events. If we start with the cephalic phase, cephalic refers to the head. So remember that even the sight and thought of food will stimulate, or the taste or the smell, will stimulate long reflexes that will activate the digestive processes and will stimulate secretory activity of the cells in the gastric glands of the stomach. The gastric phase refers to once stuff is in the stomach, so there's stomach distension now, there's stretching of the walls of the stomach. That's going to activate the mechanoreceptors, and that's going to increase vagus nerve activity. The vagus nerve is your primary parasympathetic nerve supply in your body, so that's going to activate digestive secretions within the wall of the stomach, and as well foods that are in the stomach now, especially proteins, and we see caffeine as well, will cause a rise in the pH, and this will activate chemoreceptors. So remember, the stomach normally is a very acidic environment, and so when we add food to that very acidic fluid, it's going to cause that acidity to decrease, so the pH will begin to rise in the stomach, and that will stimulate the G cells to release gastrin, the hormone gastrin. And remember that gastrin will then travel through the circulatory system, and part of its function will be to, again, when it comes back to the stomach, is to activate the chief cells and the parietal cells to increase their secretions. The intestinal phase refers to the presence of low pH and partially digestive foods that are now entering into the duodenum, because remember, when stuff is going to get squirted into the duodenum from the stomach, it's going to be very acidic when it first enters into the duodenum. And so the presence of this stuff in the duodenum will also stimulate the stomach to continue increasing its gastric secretions to continue with the digestive process of the food that's still in the stomach. If we look at the right side of the chart, the inhibitory events, so for example, loss of appetite, depression, so emotional states can be an inhibitory action. It'll inhibit the digestive processes in the body. Excessive acidity, so the fact that your pH is less than 2 implies that there's nothing in the stomach that's making it less acidic. So there's not food present, so that's going to be inhibitory on the G cells. If you don't have food present, we don't need to release gastrin to increase secretions of digestive juices. Emotional upset is generally, when you're emotionally upset, you're increasing your sympathetic nervous system activity because it's a stressor, and we know that sympathetic nervous system activity will inhibit digestive processes in the body, so it'll override parasympathetic control of digestion. Also, as more stuff is entering into the small intestine, into the duodenum, and there's the presence then of the fatty or acidic chyme that enters into the duodenum, that will have eventually a negative effect on gastric activity, because once you're emptying the stomach and the duodenum is having more stuff in it, more stuff is now in the small intestine, and that'll be monitored by pH, acidic pH, plus the stretch of the walls of the small intestine. That information will reflex back to the stomach, and it'll be inhibitory. So eventually you don't want gastric secretions to be released continually from the stomach cells if there's nothing in the stomach. So once you're getting a lot of input from the small intestine, it means most of the stuff now is in the small intestine, and that'll send signals back to the stomach to stop secreting the digestive juices. The last one, distension, presence of fatty, acidic, partially digested food in the duodenum. Yes, I think we already discussed that, so we'll leave it at there. Last thing we'll look at with this presentation is just the regulation of the gastric emptying, or the movement of the chyme from the stomach into the duodenum. Generally carbohydrate-rich chyme, so food that you're consuming is high in carbohydrates and low in fat, tends to move quickly through the stomach and into the duodenum. Fat-laden chyme then, so if you are eating a lot of fatty foods, it tends to be moved more slowly, so digestion is a slower process. It remains in the stomach longer. And then once the chyme is being pushed into the duodenum through the pyloric sphincter, it'll be delivered in small amounts to the duodenum. So remember that the chyme that will enter into the duodenum is very acidic still. So we have to release a little bit at a time, because one of the first things that will happen once it enters into the duodenum is that there has to be some neutralizing of the acidity to occur, because it's, again, the acidity can damage the wall of the duodenum itself and create duodenal ulcers, for example. So we are going to release a little bit of chyme at a time into the duodenum. A little bit is released, and most of it is forced back into the stomach with each contraction. And little by little, the chyme will enter into the duodenum for further processing.